The roar of the Apache's rotors was a constant companion, a rhythm in my blood, a percussive beat against the vast, indifferent sky of Afghanistan. For 29 years, I'd chased purpose, but the last 7 had truly defined me. First Lieutenant Maya Ramirez, U.S. Army, pilot of a war machine designed for death, yet often used to pluck life from the jaws of chaos. Bagram was a universe unto itself, a sprawling city of blast walls and dust, where every sunrise brought the promise of another grueling mission, another chance to make a difference, another layer of desert grit beneath my fingernails, clinging to my fatigues, seeping into my very soul. My life revolved around the whirring blades, the scent of jet fuel mixed with fine sand, and the silent, heavy weight of a mission that, at its core, was about saving lives, even as we risked our own every single time we lifted off the tarmac. My days were a blur of pre-flight checks under a brutal, relentless sun, intelligence briefings in air-conditioned tents that never quite cooled the rage, and the high-stakes dance of a gunship over hostile terrain. The world outside the cockpit was a dangerous, volatile place, a mosaic of ancient villages and desolate mountains where threats lurked in every shadow. Yet, the most brutal attack I would face didn't come from a hidden insurgent's rocket, or the desperate gunfire of the Taliban. It landed silently, insidious as a desert scorpion, in the secure messages on my government-issued tablet, pinging in just past 9 in the evening, Bagram time. The day had been long, hot, and tense, a medevac run under heavy fire, followed by a scramble to resupply an isolated outpost. I was bone-weary, smelling of sweat and adrenaline, looking forward to a quick shower and maybe a half-hour of quiet before collapsing onto my cot. It was from David. My fiancé, safe and sound, thousands of miles away back in Clarksville, Tennessee, nestled in the green hills I longed for. The man who was supposed to be waiting, building our future, holding down the fort while I did my duty. I remember the slight tremor in my hand as I opened it. A message from home was always a jolt, a connection to a different life, a reminder of what I was fighting for. This one was different. 15 words. 15 icy daggers plunged into my chest, each one twisting deeper than the last, delivered with the chilling efficiency of a surgical strike. It's over. Business failed. I'm gone. Good luck. My breath caught, a physical blow, sharper than any G-force I'd ever pulled in a desperate evasion maneuver. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp, leaving me hollow. My vision blurred, the harsh fluorescent lights of the common room, where a few other pilots were unwinding over lukewarm coffee, shimmering into distorted halos. My beautiful, complicated David, the man I was going to marry, the man who had promised me a future beyond the rotor wash and the sand, a life filled with quiet mornings and the smell of pine in the Tennessee woods. Gone, just like that. A future, meticulously planned and dreamed, evaporated in a handful of characters on a screen. Below the text, 2 images. The first, a gleaming, blood-red luxury sports car, sleek and impossibly out of place, parked right in front of the small, hand-built log cabin we'd poured our hearts and life savings into. Our dream. Our glamping project, nestled in the Tennessee hills, a haven we'd envisioned for weary souls seeking peace. The cabin, with its wide porch and stone fireplace, was supposed to be our sanctuary, the place we'd start a family, a retreat from the world's harshness. The license plate on the car screamed dreamer, and suddenly, the irony was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth, like biting down on a live round. David had been the dreamer, yes, but I had been the one who worked, who saved, who deployed to this forgotten corner of the world, endured the hell of combat so his dreams could take flight. So our dreams could take flight. And now, some other dreamer was driving off in a luxury car, parked at our cabin, a trophy on the ruins of my sacrifice. But it was the second image that truly stopped my heart, ripping it from my chest and leaving a gaping, bleeding wound. Not a photo, but a scanned letter. A formal letter, official and sterile. From the Tennessee Greyhound Adoption Center. Dated just a week ago, a few days before I was scheduled for my next R&R. My eyes scanned the words, but only a few managed to pierce the fog of my shock, each one a shard of ice, Spirit, our records indicate rehomed to another farm due to unforeseen circumstances. Spirit. My rescue greyhound, with her gentle, soulful eyes and her goofy, loping gait. The dog David had told me, with a mournful sigh just a month prior, his voice thick with what I'd thought was genuine grief, had died suddenly in a tragic accident, hit by a car on a lonely country road. He'd even cried, or at least pretended to, on the video call, wiping away tears as I offered my condolences, feeling helpless and heartbroken from half a world away. He'd promised me a little memorial in the garden, a special spot for her favorite toy. And I had mourned her, truly mourned her, carrying that grief like another weight on my shoulders through every dust storm and every combat mission. My spirit wasn't dead, she was rehomed, meaning David had lied, about everything, about her death, about our future, about us. The lie about spirit was the cruelest cut, a desecration of the one pure, uncomplicated love I had left back home. It was an act of pure, unadulterated malice, designed to twist the knife. The noise of the bass, the distant hum of generators, the laughter of fellow soldiers playing cards in the corner, the clatter of mess hall trays, all faded into a muffled roar, as if I'd suddenly been submerged underwater. I was an Apache pilot, a warrior, trained to face down threats with deadly precision, to keep my cool under fire, to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. But nothing in my training, no amount of combat stress inoculation, prepared me for this kind of enemy. This silent, insidious invasion of my most private world, delivered across 8,000 miles by a man I had loved with all my heart, a man I had trusted implicitly. The war had always been over there, a clear enemy, a defined battlefield. Now, with a few cold words, a lying photograph, and the crushing revelation about my dog, it had followed me home, into the very sanctuary of my soul. It was personal. Very, very personal. And something inside me, something I hadn't known was there, until this devastating moment, started to hum. A low, dangerous thrum, like an engine winding up for a fight. A war was coming home, and I was going to fly it. The world tilted. Or maybe it was just me. The air rushed out of my lungs with a sound like a distant artillery shell hitting sand, leaving me hollowed out, gasping for something I couldn't find. A low hum started in my ears, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the hum of the bass generator, the distant chatter of my squad mates, everything. My vision narrowed, the bright desert sun blurring at the edges of my focus until all I could see was the glowing screen in my shaking hand. The message was a jumble of characters, a foreign language I couldn't process. And the photo. A picture of David, smiling, his arm around some woman whose face was strategically out of frame, in front of a sprawling, half-built structure I immediately recognized. It was the main lodge for our glamping project. Our project. The one he'd sworn was going to be our future, our haven away from the dust and chaos of deployment. But the smile on his face wasn't for me, and the woman beside him definitely wasn't me. It was a spear, perfectly aimed, twisting in a wound I hadn't even known I had. My fingers, clumsy and numb, fumbled with the screen. There were attachments, a whole string of them, each one a small digital grenade. I opened them, one after another, the buzzing in my ears growing louder, more insistent. The first was a contract for the sale of the land, signed and dated a little over 2 months ago. The second, a bank statement for the project's account, sitting at a perfectly round zero balance. The third, a transfer of ownership for our truck, the one we'd bought together, the one I'd poured my combat bonus into. Each click was a small, sharp pain, a tiny crack in the dam of my composure. Then came the last one, the one that truly broke the surface of my reality, a formal, legally binding document. Transfer of ownership spirit, my big, goofy, loyal spirit. The pain that shot through me was instant, visceral, like shrapnel tearing through soft tissue. Spirit, my dog, the one I had raised from a pup, the one who'd waited faithfully for me through every rotation, every mission, every long-distance call. He wasn't just a pet, he was my anchor, my touchstone to home, a warm, furry piece of my soul. But the initial agony of seeing that document, that cold, legal proof of his loss, quickly curdled into something far more corrosive. It wasn't just loss anymore, it was betrayal. A sick, twisted, elaborate performance designed to gut me. The memory of David's voice, thick with what I now knew were crocodile tears, came crashing back to me with the force of an IED blast. It was just after dawn 2 months ago, exactly when that land sale contract was dated. He'd called me, his voice choked with sobs, telling me Spirit had gotten out, had run into the road, hit by a speeding car. He'd barely been able to get the words out, his voice cracking, promising me he'd buried Spirit under our favorite oak, right by the pond. I'd been in a sand-choked foxhole, miles from anywhere, the smell of cordite still clinging to my uniform. I'd cried then, hot, racking sobs that shook my entire body, tears streaming down my dusty face, blurring the desert horizon. I'd cried for Spirit, for the gaping hole he'd left in my heart, for the unfairness of it all, that I was thousands of miles away, fighting someone else's war, while my boy was taken from me. My squad leader had had to pull me off the comms, letting me grieve in the desolate silence of the pre-dawn desert, thinking my world had been irrevocably shattered by a cruel twist of fate. And now this. This cold, hard truth laid bare on a pixelated screen. Every tear he'd shed, every broken word, every anguished promise, all of it a lie. A meticulously crafted, utterly depraved lie, spun with the sole purpose of inflicting maximum pain. The glamping project, the empty bank account, the truck, Spirit. Not just a broken heart, but a full-spectrum assault on everything I held dear, everything I'd worked for. The anger didn't explode in a fiery burst, it congealed, freezing solid in my veins, cold and heavy as a lead blanket draped over my shoulders. This wasn't a messy breakup, a misunderstanding, or even a typical act of infidelity. This was an ambush. And in my world, an ambush isn't just a battle, it's a declaration of war. He just didn't realize he'd opened fire on an Apache. The Afghan night sky was a black velvet canvas, so vast and indifferent it almost swallowed the harsh glow of the base lights. I lay there, stretched out on my cot, the dull ache of my newly bandaged arm, a constant reminder of the fight earlier, but it was nothing compared to the phantom wounds clawing at my chest. Why? The question echoed in the cavern of my mind, a relentless drumbeat against the distant thrum of generators and the occasional chirp of desert insects. Why had it all gone so wrong? Why him? Why me? My thoughts drifted back, past the dust and the danger, past the sweat and the camaraderie that had become my new normal, to a time that felt like another lifetime. David. His name still left a sour taste on my tongue, like an old MRE past its expiration date. I remembered him differently then, of course. He was a whirlwind of charm and easy smiles, with eyes that promised a future bathed in sunlight. We met at a base BBQ, just a few weeks after I'd been promoted to captain. He was a contractor, always buzzing with ideas, always making me laugh just after sunset, when the heat of the day started to recede and the air became bearable. He'd talked about us, about a life we'd build together, a home with a big porch and a dog, maybe even a couple of kids who'd inherit my grit and his good looks. I'd believed him. Every word. I'd wanted to believe him. The idea that my success, my hard-won promotions, and the increased pay that came with them, would only elevate us both, seemed so natural, so right. He had these visionary business ideas, he called them. And I, like a fool, poured my hard-earned money and even harder-won optimism into them. First, there was Summit Seekers, an adventure travel app that he swore would revolutionize how outdoor enthusiasts connected. It never got past the wireframe stage, never even saw a single line of code written, but it cost me a good $8,000 for development costs that somehow evaporated. Then, Gourmet Grinders, a high-end sandwich shop concept that was supposed to be the next big thing in artisanal fast food. We spent months finding a location, drafting menus, even buying a few pieces of professional kitchen equipment, all on my dime, of course. It never opened. Not a single sandwich was ever served. Each failure, according to David, was never his fault. It was always the volatile market, the unforeseen logistical nightmares, or the lazy, unreliable partners who just couldn't grasp his genius. He always had an excuse, polished and ready, just like he had a smile for every senior officer we'd meet at the chow hall on base. But the smiles began to crack as my career truly took off. When I got my next promotion, just a little past 8 in the morning on a Tuesday, to major, and the paychecks started looking even healthier, David's initial pride morphed into something uglier. It began subtly, with sarcastic, joking jabs at our friends' parties. We'd be at a fellow officer's house, grilling burgers around 3 in the afternoon, the smell of charcoal and beer heavy in the air, and he'd clap me on the back a little too hard. "There's my iron woman," he'd declare, loud enough for everyone to hear, earning the big bucks while I'm just here keeping the home fires burning, right, honey? His eyes would twinkle, but it wasn't humor, it was venom. Later, the sly remarks would escalate. My strong female soldier, he'd muse, watching me lift a heavy cooler or change a flat tire with practiced ease. So capable, so independent. Doesn't really need a man for anything, does she? The words were sweet, coated in feigned admiration, but the undertone was a sharp, cutting blade. Then there was his family. His mother, Evelyn, was a masterpiece of passive aggression. Every time we visited, she'd look at me with those cool, assessing eyes, a thin smile plastered on her lips. She'd offer me sweet advice, delivered with the clink of porcelain teacups around 4 in the afternoon on a Sunday. "You know, dear," she'd purr, "it's just so lovely what you do." But a woman's true place, her true power, is in building a home, a sanctuary. A kitchen, isn't it? That's where real nurturing happens. I'd grit my teeth, picturing her own meticulously sterile, rarely used kitchen. It was always about diminishing me, subtly, elegantly, ensuring I knew my place in her son's shadow. But the final, crushing blow, the one that truly cemented David as not just a parasite but a predator, came later. He convinced my parents, my dear, trusting parents, to invest in a once-in-a-lifetime real estate opportunity he'd supposedly stumbled upon. It was just before lunch on a bright spring day, I remember, when he called them, spinning tales of guaranteed returns and a solid investment in their golden years. He talked them into pulling $15,000, every last cent of their modest retirement savings, out of their account. Not for a real estate opportunity, of course. That was a phantom. A few weeks later, around 5 in the evening, he pulled up to our apartment in a gleaming, cherry-red luxury sports car, a brand new model I knew cost every bit of that $15,000. He said it was a business investment, a way to look the part for potential clients. My heart sank, a lead weight plunging into an icy abyss. I knew. I just knew. All those fragmented pieces, the initial charm, the failed ventures, the bitter jokes, Evelyn's condescending remarks, and finally, the blatant theft from my parents, coalesced into a grotesque, undeniable picture. It wasn't just jealousy of my career. It was a calculated, insidious campaign to dismantle me, to crush my spirit, to sever the very roots of my independence. Looking up at the indifferent Afghan sky, the rage that had been simmering beneath my skin for so long finally boiled over. The why no longer felt like a question, but a declaration. And I knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in my bones, that there would be a reckoning. He had started a war he didn't even know he was in. And I was about to bring the fight home. The cold fury that had been a block of ice in my chest for days, maybe weeks, didn't melt. Instead, it sharpened, hardening into something diamond-like, honed to a deadly point. This wasn't some personal tragedy to drown in, not a wound to nurse in the quiet corners of my mind. This was a fight. An enemy insidious and well hidden, but an enemy nonetheless, and I was a soldier. Soldiers fight. We don't just mourn, we adapt, we overcome, and then we attack. The clarity that descended upon me was absolute, cutting through the emotional fog like the spinning blades of my Apache slicing through the desert air. I remember it vividly. The dust, the oppressive heat that felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs, the metallic tang of diesel and the faint, ever-present scent of desert earth mixed with something grimmer. We were airborne just before sunset, the sun bleeding orange across the desert horizon, painting the sky in violent hues of crimson and gold. A 9-line came in over the comms, urgent, breathless troops in contact, multiple casualties, Immediate medevac requested. My heart hammered against my ribs, a familiar drumbeat of adrenaline. This was where I belonged, where the world made brutal, terrifying sense. My hands, calloused and strong, gripped the controls, a sense of purpose flooding through me, pushing out the bitter tang of betrayal that had clung to me like a second skin. We were barely on the ground for a minute, the Apache's rotors still churning the air into a deafening storm of sand and debris, when the tracer rounds started zipping past, green, red, like deadly fireflies dancing a macabre jig in the twilight. Contact left. Someone yelled over the intercom, and my door gunner immediately returned fire, the rhythmic thud of his M240 echoing in my ears, making my teeth vibrate with each burst. My medic, Sergeant Miller, a stocky guy with a deceptively calm demeanor that belied his extensive combat experience, was already out, low to the ground, pulling the litter towards the huddle of infantrymen, sheltering behind a disabled vehicle. I was focused, every nerve ending alive, every sense heightened. My eyes scanned the terrain, searching for muzzle flashes, calculating our escape vector, making split-second decisions as rounds cracked past the cockpit canopy. We were a beacon, a target, a vulnerable giant hovering in a hail of lead, but we were also hope. I saw Miller and 2 infantrymen carefully lifting a casualty onto the litter. His uniform was dark with blood, blooming outward from his chest, and even from my cockpit, I could see the glazed, distant look in his young eyes. A chest wound, maybe multiple points of entry. He was barely breathing, each shallow gasp a desperate struggle against the inevitable. Got him! Miller's voice was a triumphant roar through the headset, giving me the thumbs up as they slid the litter into the cabin. The ramp went up with a hydraulic hiss, a momentary, flimsy shield against the chaos outside. Get us out of here, Lieutenant! My company pilot, a fresh-faced warrant officer named Lopez, urged, his voice tight with the strain of the moment. I pulled pitch, the bird responding instantly, a powerful beast straining against gravity. We climbed hard, banking left, hugging the contours of the wadi, using the terrain for cover. The ground fire lessened as we gained altitude, but the tension in the cabin remained a live wire, humming with unspoken fears and determined resolve. Miller was a whirlwind of motion, barking orders, cutting away the soldier's uniform with practiced efficiency, applying pressure to the wound, starting in the fore with a speed that defied the cramped, vibrating space. He was a master of controlled chaos, a human machine dedicated to saving a life. Looking back, it was in that tiny, vibrating space, filled with the roar of the engine, the smell of fear and antiseptic, and the desperate, shallow breaths of a dying boy, that something clicked into place with absolute certainty. My worth wasn't tied to a man's fickle affection, or some empty promise he'd made and broken with such casual cruelty. It wasn't in some civilian fantasy of a perfect life, a white picket fence, or a shared retirement plan. It was here, in the air. In the trembling, steady hands that signed off on a casualty report. In the fact that a young man barely out of high school was still breathing, however faintly, because we got to him in time, under fire, against all odds. This was my purpose. These were the lives I saved. This was my fight. A tangible, real fight that demanded everything I had. Later that evening, long past midnight, back at the forward operating base, the air still thrumming with the faint echo of distant artillery and the constant mechanical whine of generators, I was slumped against a cold Connects box, trying to make sense of the day's relentless assault on my senses and soul. The brutal daytime heat had finally broken, replaced by a cool, dry desert breeze that offered little comfort. My hands still trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the raw adrenaline dump, the lingering echo of life and death decisions. A shadow fell over me, long and angular in the dim light of a flickering floodlamp. It was Chief Warrant Officer Davies, a wiry man with a face like a roadmap of every deployment he'd ever been on, holding 2 steaming mugs, their warmth radiating into the cool night air. He extended one to me. "Black, 2 sugars, just how you like it," he grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble, settling down beside me with a weary sigh. His uniform smelled faintly of gun oil, stale cigarettes, and the indelible scent of countless missions. Davies had seen more battlefields than most generals would ever set foot on. He'd flown in Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. He was a living legend, a walking history book, and his words, when he chose to offer them, carried the undeniable weight of decades of experience. I took a long, grateful sip. The hot liquid scalded my tongue, but warmed something deep inside me, thawing the last vestiges of the day's chill. Thanks, Chief. I needed this. He took a slow, deliberate drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing like a tiny ember in the profound darkness of the desert night. Rough one today, huh, Lieutenant? I just nodded, unable to articulate the maelstrom of emotions swirling within me, staring out into the vast, indifferent expanse of the desert where stars glittered with an intensity rarely seen in the civilian world. He blew out a plume of smoke, a silent cloud that dissolved into the night. Don't let those bastards back home get you down, Lieutenant. The real fight's out here. His words hit me harder than any incoming round. They were a sudden, sharp clarity in the suffocating fog of my personal betrayal. He didn't know the specifics of my asterisk fight, of course, but he knew the look. The haunted eyes, the faraway gaze that signaled a war being fought on two fronts, the visible enemy abroad, and the invisible, insidious one back home. He knew about the wives who cheated, the husbands who gambled away savings, the lives unraveled by the brutal, relentless absence demanded by duty. It was a common story, one whispered in the shadows of tents and shared over lukewarm beer after missions, a dark secret shared among those who served. He saw past my uniform, past the pilot wings, to the woman beneath, hurting. And he offered me a soldier's solace, focus on the mission. His words took me back to a professional development seminar. I'd attended stateside, what felt like a lifetime ago, back when my biggest concern was my next promotion board. It was in a sterile conference room, the air conditioning far too cold for comfort, but the speaker had been anything but. General Elizabeth Liz Sanchez, retired but still sharp as a razor, stood before us, a formidable woman with a smile that could disarm a hostile and eyes that could see right through your bullshit. She had been one of the first female generals in Army aviation, a true pioneer, blazing trails through a world still overwhelmingly male. She'd shared a story, one that resonated with so many of us in that room, a chilling tale of personal vulnerability amidst professional strength. My husband, she'd said, her voice dropping to a low, powerful rumble that commanded absolute attention. While I was deployed, he systematically drained our joint accounts, mortgaged our house to the hilt, and left me with nothing but debt and a stack of legal papers when I finally came home. He saw my absence, my unwavering dedication to my country, as an opportunity to exploit, to steal, to dismantle everything we had built. A collective gasp, then a quiet murmur of understanding rippled through the room. We all knew, or knew someone who knew. The fear of that particular brand of betrayal was a silent shadow that followed many of us. As a woman in the military, she continued, her voice regaining its steel, rising with an undeniable authority, you always need a plan A, a plan B, and a holy hell, their scumbag's plan. Never ever let yourself be caught off guard. You are your own best advocate, your own protector. Build your defenses as meticulously as you plan a mission. Anticipate every enemy move, even the ones closest to home. General Sanchez's words, spoken years ago in a brightly lit room thousands of miles away, echoed in the profound silence of the desert night, amplified by Chief Davies' grizzled wisdom. My own personal holy hell, their scumbag's plan had been brewing for a while, a slow burn beneath the surface of my public composure. I'd gathered documents, screenshots, subtle evidence of a crumbling foundation I had been too busy fighting other wars to acknowledge fully. I had a lawyer's number tucked away in my secured notes, recommended by another female pilot who'd walked this treacherous path and emerged victorious. The time for grieving was over. The time for fighting had begun, and I was going to use every tool in my military arsenal. Tomorrow, first thing after my mission debrief, just after the sun climbed above the eastern dunes, I would be making a call. Not to him. Never again to him, but to the staff judge advocate's office. The JAG. It was time to bring the fight home. And this time, I was going in with air superiority, armed with purpose, and absolutely no quarter. The sterile air of the JADAG office on base felt like a neutral zone, a temporary armistice between the chaos of my life and the cold precision of military law. I walked in, my combat boots, echoing a steady rhythm on the polished linoleum, a stark contrast to the tremor I still felt deep inside. It was late morning, the sun already high, casting harsh shadows through the blinds. Major Rachel Evans, her rank gleaming on her crisp uniform, looked up from her desk. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, held a hint of weariness that spoke of battles fought not on foreign soil, but in courtrooms and behind closed doors. She gestured to the chair opposite her, a silent invitation to a conversation that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "Lieutenant Ramirez," she said, her voice calm, devoid of any prejudgment. "Have a seat." I sat, my back ramrod straight, my hands clasped loosely in my lap. The pain in my leg was a dull throb, a constant reminder of everything that had led me here. But today it was just background noise. My mind was a steel trap, every detail rehearsed, every emotion compartmentalized. I began to speak, not as a victim recounting trauma, but as an officer delivering a mission report. My voice was level, my tone precise, listing dates, facts, financial transactions, the timeline of David's betrayal laid out with the stark clarity of a battle plan. I described the deceit, the manipulation, the slow, insidious drain on my resources, the glamping business account I had poured my heart and much of my military pay into, now apparently plundered. Major Evans listened, her gaze unwavering, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer a single word of comfort or outrage. Just the occasional, almost imperceptible nod. It was like briefing a superior officer before an operation. The personal was irrelevant, only the objective mattered. I found a strange kind of strength in that detachment. It was the only way I could get through it, to present the raw, ugly truth without falling apart. When I finished, the silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. I waited, my breath held for her reaction. She leaned back in her chair, a slight smile touching the corners of her lips. It wasn't a sympathetic smile, nor one of amusement. It was something else entirely, a knowing, almost admiring curve of the mouth. "Welcome to the club, Lieutenant," she said, her voice a low, gravelly hum. "You're not the first, and certainly not the last. But you might be the best prepared I've ever seen." Her words hit me, not with the sting of a fresh wound, but with the cool clarity of recognition. I hadn't known there was a club, but I instantly understood its membership. And then, I laid out my final card. 3 years ago, Major, after my first deployment, I set up an irrevocable trust. I explained, the words feeling almost foreign, alien to the carefully constructed narrative of victimhood I had just presented. All my military pay, a significant portion of my savings, even the proceeds from selling my old motorcycle, went into it. It's untouchable. My name isn't directly on the paperwork, just a series of legal designations. I wanted to protect myself, my future, from anything unforeseen. You learn to plan for every contingency out there, Major, especially when you're facing down the unknown in a hostile environment. That kind of foresight doesn't just apply to enemy combatants. Her smile widened, a flicker of genuine appreciation in her eyes. "And the glamping business?" she prompted, her voice soft. That account, I admitted, a bitter taste in my mouth, but also a surge of something cold and powerful. I deliberately left it exposed. It was a test, a bait. I wanted to see how far he would go. I gave him a gun, Major, and I waited to see if he'd pull the trigger. He did. My voice was devoid of inflection, a flat statement of fact. But inside, a tempest raged, the anger that had been simmering for weeks, finally solidifying into something sharp and unyielding. It wasn't rage that consumed, but a focused, surgical intent. Major Evans chuckled softly, a sound that held both respect and a touch of grim humor. "Lieutenant Ramirez," she said, her gaze firm, "you're an artist." In that moment, something shifted deep within me. The knot of fear, the suffocating shame, the raw, wounded despair, they all began to unravel, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't a victim anymore. Not truly. I was a combatant who had laid a trap, a strategist who had anticipated the enemy's move. The pain in my leg, the phantom aches in my soul, They were no longer liabilities. They were fuel. I looked at Major Evans, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw not just a way out, but a way forward. I was a warrior, and the war, in its most insidious form, had indeed come home. Major Evans picked up her phone, her fingers moving with swift efficiency. "This is Major Evans. I need a freeze on all accounts associated with a David Evans. No, not related. Just a coincidence of name. And I want a full SCRA activation, effective immediately. Consider this a full investigation, starting now." She glanced at me, a silent promise in her eyes. The hunt had begun, and I was no longer the prey. The email to David was short, just 5 words, a single question mark hanging heavy at the end. "Are you absolutely sure?" It was a challenge, a final chance for him to confess, to show even a sliver of the man I thought I once knew. I sent it from a burner account, untraceable, a ghost in the digital wind. The silence that followed for the next few days was a testament to his arrogance, his certainty that I would eventually just fade away, another casualty in his long line of conquests. Then, just before noon one day, my satellite phone, the one I kept for emergencies and classified communications, began to shriek. It wasn't the calm, measured tone of Major Evans. This was a raw, unfiltered assault on my eardrums, a sound I hadn't heard since my last deployment when a stray round whizzed a little too close to my head. I checked the caller ID. Evelyn Bishop, David's mother. The matriarch. I took a deep breath, the desert wind outside my makeshift office in the dusty base camp, doing little to cool the sudden surge of adrenaline. Maya. Her voice was a high-pitched wail, a banshee tearing through the satellite connection. "What in God's name have you done? David's accounts are all frozen. He can't even buy food! My poor boy!" The sound of her distress was almost comical, if the circumstances weren't so infuriatingly serious. My hand tightened around the phone, my knuckles turning white. I said nothing, letting her tirade echo in the small, sterile room. "He's in such deep trouble, Maya!" "And what about Chloe?" "The sweet girl he's been dating. She just told me she's pregnant. With my grandchild. How could you do this to your own nephew, to your family?" Her words were a calculated volley, designed to hit every emotional pressure point. The mention of Chloe and a supposed pregnancy barely registered as anything more than a cheap, desperate tactic. I'd seen better attempts at psychological warfare from insurgents in dusty villages. The raw, guttural anger that had simmered for weeks finally began to boil over. Family? He hadn't thought of family when he stole from me, when he let spirit die. When I finally spoke, my voice was a flat, even tone, each word carefully enunciated, stripped of any warmth or emotion. "If that is your grandchild, Mrs. Bishop, then I suggest David find a job. Perhaps a real one. Something where he actually earns his keep, instead of living off the money of others." The line went silent for a moment, a rare victory against Evelyn's relentless accusations. I could almost hear her sputtering on the other end, her carefully constructed narrative of victimhood crumbling around her. I didn't wait for a reply. I hung up. The next communication came not through a frantic call, but a whiny email, delivered to my encrypted inbox late in the afternoon. It was from David, full of self-pity, devoid of any genuine remorse. He rambled about misunderstandings, pressure, bad influences. Not a single word of apology for the stolen funds, not a single acknowledgement of Spirit, the dog whose memory haunted my sleep. He played the victim, the innocent caught in a web of my making. It was a performance so transparent, so utterly predictable, that it almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, a cold, hard resolve settled deep in my chest. I forwarded the entire email to Major Evans with a single, succinct line: "More evidence for the file. This one's a classic, sir." The final call came well past sunset, the desert night air already chilling, stars beginning to prick the black canvas above. Howard Bishop, David's father, the true patriarch. His voice was a low growl, colder and more controlled than Evelyn's hysteria, but far more menacing. "Maya," he began, no pleasantries, no softening. "You will drop this lawsuit. Immediately. For the honor of our family." His tone left no room for debate, a direct command from a man used to being obeyed without question. He was testing me, pushing the boundaries, expecting me to fold under the weight of his authority, the unspoken threat of his influence. My years in the service, the countless hours of training, the battles fought and won, had stripped away any fear of such men. "Mr. Bishop," I responded, my voice as steady as a sniper's aim, "your family's honor was destroyed by your son, not by me. And frankly, sir, my duty is to my country and to myself, not to a thief and a liar. I have nothing but contempt for a man who would steal from a wounded soldier, and even less for those who enable him. And yes, I will meet you and your son and anyone else who chooses to aid his despicable actions in court. We can discuss family honor there." I ended the call with a definitive click, the sound reverberating in the quiet of my tent. No turning back now. This wasn't just about money. It was about truth, justice, and the principle that even a wounded soldier, a woman, deserved to stand her ground. I immediately dialed Major Evans, the number etched into my memory. "Sir," I stated, my voice firm, full force. "No quarter. The gloves are off. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready for war." The secure video line crackled to life, the pixelated faces of Major Evans and Rebecca Chen, my civilian lawyer, materializing on the screen. It was late afternoon, the sun already dipping low over the base, casting long shadows across my small room. My uniform still felt heavy, a second skin, but this battle wasn't fought with rifles or Apache helicopters. This was different, insidious, burrowing beneath the surface of my life. I took a deep breath, the familiar scent of antiseptic from my recent checkup still clinging faintly to my clothes. The past few weeks had been a blur of recovery, physical therapy, and relentless calls from David's family. They had tried everything: pleas for understanding, veiled threats about my military career, tearful demands for me to remember the good times. Each call was a fresh wound, twisting the knife of betrayal deeper. They spoke of reconciliation, of family honor, but all I heard was a desperate attempt to manipulate, to silence me, to sweep David's monstrous actions under a rug woven from their own denial. "I'm done," I stated, my voice steady, betraying none of the tremor that sometimes still gripped my hands. "I no longer care for a settlement. I want justice. I want accountability for every action, every lie, every stolen moment of my life." Rebecca Chen, a woman whose sharp intellect was matched only by the almost predatory glint in her eyes, offered a smile that didn't quite reach them. It was a grim, satisfied curve of her lips. "That," she responded, her voice a low purr, "is exactly what I wanted to hear." A few days later, a cold dread settled in my stomach when an email from Ms. Patterson, my neighbor back in Clarksville, pinged onto my secure tablet. The subject line read, "He's gone." She detailed how the county sheriff, a man with a kind, weary face I'd seen around town, had escorted David, my fiancé, as he'd brazenly called himself, from my home. Attached was a grainy video clip from her security camera, time-stamped just after dawn on a Tuesday morning. It showed David, alongside another burly man I didn't recognize, systematically loading my personal belongings onto a beat-up old truck. My mother's antique piano, the one I'd painstakingly restored after she passed, was being manhandled onto the ramp, its ivory keys glinting forlornly in the weak morning light. Then my family photo albums, decades of memories, snapshots of birthdays, Christmases, my dad's silly fishing trips tossed carelessly into a cardboard box. My anger wasn't a raging inferno, it was a glacier, vast and unyielding, slowly grinding everything in its path. He wasn't just taking my things, he was trying to erase me, to obliterate any trace of my existence from the home I had built, the life I had meticulously carved out for myself. The phone rang again, Rebecca's number flashing on the screen. "Brittany," she announced without preamble. "David's investor. She contacted us." My blood ran cold. Brittany, the woman David had been parading around Clarksville as his new business partner. Rebecca recounted Brittany's confession, her voice devoid of emotion, each word a hammer blow. David had told Brittany that I had been killed in action in Afghanistan. He was the grieving widower, the sole heir, the tragic hero left to pick up the pieces. He had woven an entire reality around my presumed death, using my service, my sacrifice, as the foundation for his elaborate fraud. My supposed demise wasn't just a lie, it was his twisted origin story. a convenient fiction to justify his avarice. The pieces clicked into place, forming a horrifying mosaic of calculated deceit. It wasn't just about stolen money. It was about stolen identity, stolen grief, a stolen future. The FBI, Rebecca explained, had taken over the case. Wire fraud, identity theft, fraud against the United States government, the charges piled up like discarded ammunition casings. The total amount David had siphoned away, she informed me with a grim satisfaction that I now understood, had quietly surged past $100,000, a staggering sum that made my stomach churn. David, the man who had once promised me forever under the vast, star-pricked sky of a Texas night, was apprehended just before sunset at a Greyhound bus station in Nashville. He had a battered suitcase by his side, stuffed with nearly $10,000 in crisp bills, a desperate, last-ditch attempt at escape. His one-way ticket to Miami lay tucked inside his wallet, a pathetic symbol of his shattered dreams. The next morning, his face gaunt, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, stared out from the front page of the local newspaper, hands cuffed behind his back. The Bishop family's carefully constructed facade of respectability, their pride, their very name, crumbled into dust with that single, devastating photograph. The wheels of justice, slow but inexorable, had finally turned. David, cornered and with no viable escape, accepted a plea deal. 12 years in a federal prison, full restitution for every dime he'd stolen, and a complete relinquishment of any rights to our marital property. It was over legally. But the emotional scars, those ran deeper than any judge's verdict could reach. Then came the last call. Their numbers, once burned into my memory, now just a blocked entry on my phone. David's parents, their voices thick with tears, pleaded, implored, begged for mercy. They spoke of his mistakes, of a momentary lapse, of how much he loved me. The words were hollow, echoing in the vast emptiness their son had created. I let them finish, listening to the desperate, broken pleas that once might have swayed me, but no longer held any power. When they paused, my voice, calm and firm, filled the silence. He was my husband, I told them, each word deliberate, when he lied about the death of our dog. He was my husband when he stole my life savings while I was serving our country in a war zone, risking everything. Now, he is a federal prisoner, and I am not married to a federal prisoner. The line went dead, a final definitive click. I blocked their number, not just from my phone, but from my life forever. The fight was over, but the rebuilding, I knew, had only just begun. And the hardest part, perhaps, was learning to trust the quiet that settled after the storm. The final call ended, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. The war was over. David's twisted campaign against me concluded. But there was no surge of victory, no triumphant roar in my chest, just an echoing emptiness, a bone-deep weariness that settled into my very core. I felt like a hollowed-out shell, the battle having consumed every ounce of my fire, leaving only ash. A few days crept by, each one a sluggish march through the lingering haze of combat fatigue. Then, tucked into my mail slot at the barracks, I found a plain manila envelope. My name scrawled on it, unmistakably Sarah's handwriting. My heart gave a little hitch. Sarah, my rock, the one who'd taken Spirit in, shielding him from the storm I'd inadvertently unleashed. Inside, I found not just a letter, but a small, stiff card. Printed on it, clear and distinct, was the tiny paw print of a dog. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the note. The words were simple, childlike, as if Spirit himself had penned them. Mommy, I miss you. I waited for you at the door so much. I have so many licks for you. Love you, Spirit. That was it. The dam broke. I didn't just cry, I shattered. Hot, raw sobs tore from my throat, a torrent of grief, anger, and relief washing over me. It was a visceral, cleansing cry that shook me to my core, emptying out every last drop of poison I'd held inside. I wept for Spirit, for his innocent, boundless love that had been so cruelly weaponized. I cried for the woman I had been, blind and trusting, believing in the man David had pretended to be. I wept for the betrayal, the pain, the sheer, crushing weight of it all. But as the tears flowed, something shifted. A quiet resolve settled within me. I forgave myself for my naivete, for the mistakes made in the fog of a love that was never real. And then I chose to release him. To release the anger, the bitterness, the craving for retribution that had become a bitter anchor around my heart. David was facing his own demons, a 12-year sentence in a federal prison. His punishment was not my burden to carry, nor would it be my victory. My revenge, I whispered to the empty barrack room, my voice hoarse but firm, will not be his 12 years behind bars. My revenge will be my peace. My revenge will be the successful career I continue to build. The joy I find in the smallest things. The happy, peaceful life I will create for myself. A life he will never, ever be able to touch. With just a few weeks left until my deployment officially ended, I reached out to the Tennessee Greyhound Rescue Center. I found another abandoned soul there, a greyhound with eyes as sad and deep as my own had been for too long. A quiet, gentle creature that deserved a second chance. I named her Justice. She was a silent promise to myself, a tangible symbol of the new beginning I was fighting for. My flight home landed a little past noon, under a sky that felt impossibly vast and blue. Jenna was waiting, her arms open, her embrace a lifeline. And then, Spirit, a blur of gray and white, barking his joyful greeting, showering me with the countless licks he'd promised. Stepping into my own house, I breathed a sigh of pure relief. It was clean, stripped bare of any lingering scent or shadow of David or his mother. The squat oak coffee table, once a symbol of my humiliation, of his casual disregard for my history, now stood transformed. It was no longer a place of shame but a silent memorial, a testament to the battle I had fought and, against all odds, had won. My welcome home party wasn't a raucous affair, but a quiet, deeply meaningful gathering. A small, select group, my chosen family, Jenna, of course Sarah, whose loyalty was a beacon, Ms. Patterson, solid and wise, Rebecca Chen, sharp and spirited, and Sergeant Martinez, whose gruff exterior hid a heart of gold. We sat on my porch, under a sky peppered with the first stars of evening, sharing stories, laughter, and the quiet understanding that binds souls forged in fire. This was my tribe, bound not by blood, but by unwavering loyalty, profound respect, and an unbreakable chain of support. Months flowed into a new rhythm. I settled back into my work at the hospital on Fort Campbell, my days filled with purpose, my nights peaceful. The old wounds were healing slowly, steadily, leaving behind not scars, but resilience. My life had found its cadence, a harmony I hadn't known was possible. Then, one crisp morning, just after sunrise, an email landed in my inbox. It was from a young lieutenant, recently assigned to a deployment, seeking advice on how to protect her finances, her future, before she left. I smiled, a genuine, full-hearted smile that reached my eyes. It wasn't just an email, it was a profound sense of purpose unfolding before me. David might have been the author of my pain, but I, Meyer Alston, was undeniably the author of my legacy. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a story already forming in my mind, a roadmap for the young woman on the other side of the screen. I began to type, the words flowing effortlessly. Dear Lieutenant, thank you for reaching out. Please, let me tell you a story.